So again, the goal of these soybean schools are to really give time to deep dive into a certain production topic. And Morgan asked me to deep dive into core agronomics for double crop soybeans. And I just want to say, I think this is the first time in the past 6 years that I've been asked to speak specifically on double crop soybeans. Most of our efforts have been in full season soybeans and really early planting situations. So I had to do some self-reflection on the research portfolio over the past 6 years and really think, all right, what have we done in a true double crop situation planted behind wheat? And the answer is pretty little, really, in all honesty. You can see the research topics we've addressed over the past 5 years. There's a lot of things up there. The things that are highlighted in red have some implications for double crop production, but a lot of the core agronomic research we've done in late planting situations hasn't followed wheat. I still think there is some applicability for the double crop acres, and we'll discuss that today, but want to be transparent. We have a pretty limited amount of recent data on double crop acres, soybeans planted behind wheat. We have plenty of data on late planted soybeans, but we have some new research areas in the program. We'll be ramping things up with double crop beans over the next couple years. So knowing that background, I will just say the objectives for the presentation today is to talk about some core soybean agronomics, and I think it's a true reflection of soybeans planted in late planting situations. For planting date, maturity group, and seeding rate, we'll talk about each of those topics, and then we'll highlight a decision support tool that's coming out in early April of this year that's going to help you make management decisions on double crop acres, but also all of your soybean acres. And that tool and a lot of these recommendations are coming out of research that we've done over the past 5 years in the state, where we were really focused on updating our fundamental soybean agronomic recommendations. It's been a while since that's been done in North Carolina. So we looked at the diversity of the planting dates used in the state, which, as you know, are March through July, really into early August in parts of the state. We looked at the diversity of maturity groups that we use, which are 2 through 7, and we looked at a variety of seeding rates within each of those planting date maturity group combinations. And generally, you'll hear me talk about yield and sometimes seed quality, but just so y'all know, we also have data about how all these production practices impact protein, oil, plant height, green stem flower timing, other things that are important at current, or like protein and oil will become increasingly important in the future. And so we've done all this research across the state now at 20 sites. So we've got a lot of data, thousands and thousands of data points to make these core agronomic recommendations. I do want to remind you a couple things about this data set. First, when you look at our yields, they're inflated by 15 to 30% on average because of the edge effects of our plot. So if you see all these research plots out there, there's a lot of edge effect where they're getting extra sunlight that inflates our yield. So our yields are going to look higher than what they would in your general crop beans out in your fields. I also want to remind you, in these studies, for logistical reasons, the late planting dates were not planted behind wheat. They were, wheat planting dates, let's say mid-June into early July, but they weren't actually planted behind wheat. And again, this is a large data set, and I just want to take a moment to thank all the growers and extension agents who have contributed their generosity to creating this data set. So I see Cox and Watson Ag back there, who hosted these trials in 2021. We also had these trials with Alan Balcom in Union County right when we started, and just this past year at Cameron Simpson's farm. So we've had a lot of this data coming out of Union County, and I'll just say we have the diesel bills to prove that coming from Raleigh, but have had some really good research hosts that have contributed to this data set that we're going to discuss today, and thank y'all. And also to the extension agents like Morgan and Andrew and Michaela Graham when she was here that helped host this research as well. So one thing I just want to acknowledge as we start this presentation is much of the data that I'll present in this presentation is better metabolized in a more dynamic way with a tool than it will be in the static graphs that you see in this presentation. We know that. That's why we're moving towards creating and releasing the tool. But just bear with me. This is a soybean school, so we are going to look at some graphs. But that's not ultimately the way that you'll have to use this data to benefit your operation. So let's first talk about planting date. Maybe y'all have seen this graph a couple times. Usually I'm talking about what's happening on the front end of the season, but we're going to talk about what's happening on the back end of the season today. So each of these colors represents a different region. The red dots are Piedmont locations, so more relevant for your environment. On the y-axis is yield, on the x-axis is planting date, so we have planting dates from March to early August. And if you looked all across the state of North Carolina, the single planting date that would maximize yield was May 1st. I think going into this research, a lot of us would have expected the earlier you plant, the higher yields you're going to get, and then planting yield is going to decline as planting date is delayed. But what we found very consistently across the state and in the Piedmont is that there's negative yield implications of planting too early, before mid-April, and there's also negative yield implications of planting from about past the third week of May. And we're going to talk about some of those today. So this is for the state of North Carolina. If you looked at this graph for just the Union County locations, I'm going to ask you what you think the planting date that maximized yield across these Union County locations is. And we've got Yeti cups in the back for participation and who gets it right. It's not a John Deere GPS receiver, but we've got some Yeti cups to raffle off here. So I'm going to show you this graph just for Union County and compare it to the other parts of the Piedmont. And I want you to raise your hand and guess what the single best planting date for soybeans in Union County is. Okay, May 10th. Now I'm forgetting. Oh, I was like, could it be true that that's correct? And that is correct. It is May 10th. And I don't think I've shown this slide before, so nice job. On this graph, it's sort of similar to the previous graph, but I want to say we compared Union County to the other parts of the Piedmont because growers here often say that they're able to maintain higher yields in a double crop situation than maybe other parts of the state for their soy. But you can see that the lines are pretty similar for the Piedmont, which is blue, and Union County, which is red, and that is that you're losing yield after the third week of May. So this is a double crop presentation, so let's talk about those later planting situations. All right, so if we look at planting beginning in early June out into the middle of July, which is generally when your double crop beans would be planted. When you push planting date past June 5th, in Union County, you're losing 0.63 bushels per acre per day. That's what we found in this recent research, Union County sites over the past 5 years. If you were in other parts of the Piedmont, you'd be losing 1 bushel per acre per day, so a bit more severe yield loss in other parts of the Piedmont, especially as you get, in the mountains, Yadkin County, where we've done a lot of testing. But nonetheless, even in this environment, our data has shown a considerable amount of yield loss for every day delay in planting past early June. Why is that the case? Okay, day length, I think it is related to how quickly the beans flower after they're planted and subsequently how much vegetative growth they've got. So let's talk a little bit about the relationship between planting a date and plant height and yield. So on the x-axis here we have plant height. All right, that's in inches. On the y-axis is yield. And so what would Dr. Dunphy tell you about how tall your beans needed to be for maximum yield potential? 3 feet. So Dr. Dunphy would say your beans need to be 3 feet to be at maximum yield potential. And this is a bunch of data from the past 5 years, so more recent research, and it shows pretty much the same thing. So you have a positive relationship between plant height and yield till you get to about 36 inches, which is 3 feet. At which case, then the relationship between plant height and yield flattens out. And when your beans get too tall, let's say over 45 inches, you can even see yield decline. So we know we need a certain amount of plant height and vegetation to drive yield. In our double crop situations, we're not often getting there. So if you look at this graph, it's a very similar graph to the previous. Plant heights on the x-axis, yields on the y-axis. The blue dots are June planted beans, the red dots are July planted beans. And if you look to this line, to the right of that are the beans that got over 36 inches tall in a June planting situation, which is a pretty small percentage of the planting date combinations that we looked at in this study. So we're not getting the plant height we need to drive yield. That's related to how quickly they're flowering after planting. And that's regardless of if they're in an indeterminate or determinate variety. So that's what we've been seeing, a pretty considerable yield loss in our data. But again, our plots were not planted behind wheat. So let's look at some situations where the beans were planted behind wheat. So in the official variety testing plots in Union County in 2023, there were 2 sites. Full season site, many of you probably came to the soybean field day out there at Cameron Simpson's. And then there was a double crop site, which was at another farm. And those beans were planted behind wheat. So if you look at the different maturity group categories, we had a maturity group early 4, late 4, early 5, late 5, 6s, and 7s. You can look at the full season yields for those. The full season beans were planted on May 10th in Union County this past year. You can also look at the double crop yields. Those beans were planted on June 27th. Those are the same varieties planted at the 2 different planting dates on the 2 different farms. I will acknowledge this isn't a perfect comparison because this was done on 2 different farms. But nonetheless, if you look across the different maturity groups, there's a yield loss anywhere from no yield loss with the maturity group 7s, which is kind of interesting, up to 0.26 bushels per acre per day. So I highlight this to say, it has some similarities to what we've seen in our research where we weren't planting behind wheat, but the yield loss wasn't as severe. So there's clearly going to be some interactions between if the beans were just planted late or if they were planted behind wheat. And we have to dig into that more. But I will say one thing that Union County producers have discussed with me before is they feel like that wheat residue is playing a role in conserving soil moisture for those soybeans throughout the season. And theoretically, we know that can be beneficial. For example, if beans are following a cover crop like cereal rye. But we actually have done some rotational research within the past 5 years looking at soybeans planted behind cereal rye in May, compared to beans planted behind cereal rye and crimson clover in May, compared to beans planted in May, not following anything, compared to beans planted behind rapeseed. So several of you probably have grown rapeseed over the years, compared to beans planted behind wheat, and then compared to beans planted just in June. And we looked at soil moisture dynamics following all those different scenarios. And I will say, in this research, which was done at 6 locations, including some locations in the Piedmont, we pretty rarely picked up a soil moisture benefit of having wheat out there compared to having no wheat. So I think this is a complex thing that does need to be investigated. But whether you're looking at the OVT data or the data out of our small plots over the past 5 years, it's going to be critical to make sure that your double crop beans are planted as soon as possible after wheat harvest. Y'all know that, but our research just really underscores with the newer genetics we're using, you can lose up to 0.6 bushels per acre per day with every day delay in planting. To talk about another core agronomic decision that you have to make in double crop beans, we can talk about soybean maturity groups. I'm sure you've all seen this traditional model of soybean maturity groups. This was developed in the 1970s. Why are they latitudinal zones? Well, day length is consistent across the latitudinal zones, and day length and temperature are the 2 things that drive reproductive development in soybeans. And if you think about the earlier maturity groups that they grow in the upper Midwest, those will flower with a shorter length of night. In the upper Midwest, the days are longer in the summer. And so those earlier maturing varieties, they'll flower with a shorter length of night. Whereas our later maturing varieties flower with a longer length of night. Well, we can grow all of them in North Carolina because we have the length of night that will trigger flowering, both for a later maturing variety and an earlier maturing variety. And that's why in the state we're growing maturity group 2 through 8, depending on what the production situation is. So what are some things that influence a maturity group selection for your farm? Okay, I think that was planting date. Okay, rotational complexity. Anything else? Why are y'all growing a maturity group 4 in the first place? Yield potential. So there's a variety of things that can influence maturity group decision making, and I will say, going into this research, one of the reasons we were looking at maturity group selection in late planting situations is because growers out of Union County were vocal about wanting to know what the best maturity group is to plant in a double crop situation. So I'm going to show you some data on that. I know this is a busy slide, like we're going to have a better way to look at this data, but I've blocked out the early planting dates to try to make it simpler to look at. And this is data from Union County in 2023. How many of y'all were at that site at Cameron's? Okay, quite a few. So you saw these research plots. Again, I will emphasize our yields inflated. You're going to see some of these double crop yields up into the 90s. It was a good site, but also we have a lot of edge effect on our plots. But if you look at these individual boxes, they're different maturity groups. Planting date is on the x-axis of each box, yields on the y-axis. And what I'll emphasize is in June planting, the maturity group 2s cut 57, the 3s cut 71, the 4s cut 84, the 5s and 6s and 7s cut between 93 to 96. So at that specific Union County site, we saw 5s through 7s maximize yield. They performed pretty comparably. Now, I will say if you look at the Union County data over the past few years, the maturity group 4s have hung in pretty well in a double crop situation as well. But this was the data off the Union County site in 2023. If you looked at the July planting dates, the maturity group 2 cut 46, 3 57, 4 66. The 5s and 6s were 72 to 75 bushels per acre. And so the maturity groups 5 and 6 optimized yield in that much later planting situation. That's what we saw at Cameron's family farm this past year. One site. All right, if we look at the OVT data from 2023 in Union County, how do those results compare? So if you looked at that site, which was planted again on June 27th, the early 4s cut 72 bushels per acre. The late 4s cut 70 bushels per acre. The early 5s cut 77 bushels per acre. The late 5s cut 81. The 6s cut 78. And the 7s cut 78. That's a pretty tight yield range between the 5s and the 7s that we saw at the OVT that we often see out of our small plot research. So one thing we've learned from this research is pretty consistent, not just in Union County, but other parts of the state, is that growers have some flexibility in what they're planting in a double crop situation. The historical thinking has been the later you plant, the later maturing variety you need to use. Well, we've not found that in this research. Often, for sure, the 5s through 7s perform comparably. In June planting dates, we've often seen a mid-4 up to a 7 perform very similarly for yield in those later planting situations. Now, I know one of the things that you're going to ask me in regards to maturity group and late planting situation is what about determinate and indeterminate growth habit? So we're going to talk about that in just a moment, but before we talk about that, I just want to ask you, if you're planting a 4 in a double crop planting situation and it's performing comparably to a 5 through 7, even though it's flowering earlier, what do you think the reason a maturity group 4 is bringing so much to the table for you in a double crop situation or in a full season situation? Why are they leading to higher yields? What is it about that maturity group? More breeding? Okay, fantastic. So we're going to talk a little bit about that. I would often show this slide in regards to full season planting considerations, but I think we can think about it as we're thinking about how well these earlier maturing varieties are performing in a double crop situation as well. So when we talk about how much progress the breeders are breeding is making each year, we can think about it in terms of genetic gain. So genetic gain is how much progress the breeders are making each year. That's independent of weather. That's independent of if your management strategies have changed, if you've adopted new planter technology, whatever. Genetic gain is the progress the breeders are making in making the seed better. And if you look at genetic gain across the different maturity groups, this data comes from public breeders, it comes from private breeders. They collaborated to write some papers. You can look at genetic gain in bushels per acre per year. And for the maturity group 2 and 3 varieties, the breeders are making 0.34 bushels per acre per year progress in improving the genetics in the earlier maturing varieties. If you look at the maturity group 7, they're only making 1.15 bushels per acre per year progress. So the genetics are better in the earlier maturing varieties, and I think that's a reason why they're often optimizing yield in both a full season situation and why they can hang optimizing yield in a double crop situation when they're flowering much earlier than some of these other maturity groups. I'll also just throw out that the breeders are making these genetic improvements in earlier maturing varieties specifically through making sure they have better branching ability, that they can put more pods on branches, and that they have the ability to compensate at low populations. That's why if you often look at a yield contest entry, that might be a maturity group 4.1 planted the last week of April at 80,000 seeds per acre, which is a really low population. The breeders are intentionally breeding the genetics to perform well in those types of environment. So I think genetic gain is a big reason why the earlier maturing varieties are performing so well in our environment. But a lot of people will talk about it's the fact that it's an indeterminate growth habit. And that's what I want to talk about for a moment. So if you think about the two different soybean growth habits, we have determinate soybean varieties, which have historically been planted in the state. I know you in Union County in this area have been planting earlier maturing varieties for many years, but across the state, historically, most of our beans have been determinate, which means that as soon as the bean starts flowering on the main stem, it stops putting on new vegetative growth. The indeterminate growth habits, which are generally maturity group 4.5 or earlier, will continue to put new growth on the main stem after the bean has started flowering. I do think it's important to note that yes, that will result in a longer flowering period, but maybe only 1 to 2 weeks longer than a determinate variety. Beans themselves are much more indeterminate than something like corn. So regardless of these growth habits, beans are going to flower over several weeks. Nonetheless, as we shift to using earlier maturing varieties, and also as different companies bring later maturing varieties with an indeterminate growth habit on the market, there's a lot more interface with what is the value of the indeterminate growth habit. I'm going to show some data that's been generated out of Dr. Dominic Reising's program. He's one of our row crop entomologists. And his students over really the past 4 years have been doing a lot of work to see if we need to adjust corn earworm thresholds differently for the two different types of soybean growth habit, determinate and indeterminate. And in that work, we looked at a lot of different insecticide regimes and such, but we had plots where they were fully treated with insecticides, so we were killing the corn earworm, so we're eliminating that as a factor. And in those plots, we selected soybean varieties working with the same company that were within the same relative maturity that had the two different growth habits. So like a 5.2 indeterminate, and a 5.2 determinate, and a 5.9 indeterminate, and a 5.9 determinate. And when we were controlling for earworms, and really even when we weren't, there were not differences in yield across those growth habits when they were within the same relative maturity. All right, let's look at some data from this year, albeit these are in full season planting situations, but nonetheless, my research program sort of expanded on some of that work to start looking at a broader set of maturity group 5 varieties that had both the determinate and indeterminate growth habit. We did this in 4 locations across the state. 2 of those being in the Piedmont, Union County, and Yadkin County. There was no differences in yield with these different types of growth habit when they were in the same relative maturity in the Piedmont locations. Now, at some of the other locations in Hyde County, which is out in the Blacklands, we saw the indeterminate varieties out-yield the determinate varieties. We saw the opposite in the coastal plain. So I think there's some more work to be done in this area. And I do want to highlight that Michaela Graham, who many of you all will remember because she was the extension agent here a couple years ago, is starting to work on graduate school in my program, and her research will focus on the value of this determinate and indeterminate growth habit in double crop and later planting situations, both through doing new small plot research and gleaning things out of the OVT. But at this point, when we think about planting an earlier maturing variety, whether that's in a full season situation or a double crop situation, I would just encourage you to recognize that a lot of the benefits is related to the genetic gain or the pure genetics of those varieties, and not necessarily to the growth habit, you know, it being indeterminate or determinate. And indeterminate varieties are being increasingly marketed to you in later maturities as providing some yield benefit or some stability benefit. But we really haven't seen much data to support that in our environment, nor is there much data out of the Mid-South, where they also plant the two growth habits to support that. So that's a consideration when you think about maturity group selection, and just wanted to discuss that briefly. You know, I think next year at a soybean school, we could do a total deep dive into soybean growth habit, but just a few comments on that today. And the final core agronomic production practice I'll highlight today that's been gleaned out of this research that's been done over the past 5 years is how you should adjust your soybean seeding rates when you're using these diverse planting date and maturity group combinations. You likely remember Dr. Dunphy did a lot of work with soybean seeding rates, and essentially, you know, the results showed that you needed to have at least 100 to 110,000 plants per acre in late planting situations to be at maximum yield potential. But again, we got new genetics, we've got different types of management, so let's look at what our recent research on population has shown us. So I'm going to show you here how soybean population has affected revenue, so not just yield, but revenue, considering seed costs and soybean selling price. You can see here we've got 3 different planting dates that I'll highlight. This is combined over a bunch of sites, but on average, the 3 planting dates will be June 9th, June 29th, July 19th. Seeding rates on the y-axis, and I'm going to show you for the different maturity groups, just to kind of underscore a point. This data is combined over 20 sites, so all over the state. It's not just localized to the Piedmont. But essentially what we found, before I even show you the data, is that the seeding rates that optimize revenue in double crop situations are somewhere between 140,000 to 170,000 seeds per acre. If you're planting in June with these earlier maturing varieties, you need a higher seeding rate to optimize revenue with a 2 or 3 than you do with a 6 or 7 in a full season planting situation. And the difference is about 30,000 seeds per acre, which I calculate that out. That could be an additional fungicide application, for example, which we've seen very consistently positively impact yield in the state. So I think the difference in seeding rate that optimizes revenue across these maturity groups is important and practical. If you looked at the June 29th planted beans, you'd see you needed a slightly higher seeding rate to optimize revenue, but you still see the same trend that the seeding rate you need to optimize revenue declines as your maturity group increases. So again, you need less seed to optimize revenue in a maturity group 6 than you do in a maturity group 4. And we saw the same thing for July planted beans, where again, you need less seeding rate to optimize revenue with a later maturing variety than with an earlier maturing variety. So that's in the research that we've conducted in all those small plots that, again, were not planted behind wheat, which I acknowledge planting into wheat can impact your stand. But just to show some more data from that research we did looking at all these different rotational options for planting beans in the state, whether you were planting them behind wheat, whether you were planting behind rapeseed, behind nothing in June, a cover crop in May, behind nothing in May, we saw that soybean stand across all these sites was largely unimpacted by the different production scenarios. So I think you all know how to get your planters to penetrate through this amount of residue. I think a lot of our seeding rate recommendations from that study, even though they weren't planted behind wheat, have some applicability to your double crop acres. So again, just to summarize, our double crop seeding rate recommendations sit between 140,000 to 170,000 seeds per acre. What the optimum seeding rate is, it depends on a variety of factors, including maturity group. So we talked about some 3 core agronomic production practices that could influence your double crop acres. So how do you make decisions about those production practices? We talked about maturity group, but just holistically, like how are you making decisions about planting date, maturity group, seeding rate? Okay, weather, thanks. Okay, so one of the ways that I hope that your local extension agents and NC State is here to help you is to provide data to help you make those decisions. And when you look at those core production practices across all these sites and all these planting dates and seeding rates, maturity groups, the data is very complex. So I'm just showing you this, like you don't want to look at the data this way. I don't want to look at the data this way. How are we going to look at the data and make it more usable for your operation? And the way we're going to do this is we are collaborating with the computer engineering department on campus to develop a decision support tool that will help you make better decisions using this data. And this is a project that is supported in part by the NC Plant Sciences Initiative. Morgan's an extension agent working in that network. Reggie's a grower on the advisory council. The whole idea behind that initiative is to bring together people from diverse expertise to work on agricultural issues. This is an example of that. We have a computer engineer who previously worked at Amazon helping us to develop this grower decision support tool. He wouldn't be working in agriculture without the Plant Sciences Initiative. And so where we're at in developing this tool is we have beta tested it with some growers and some agents across the state. Logan beta tested, Morgan beta tested, so if we release the tool and it sucks, you can complain to them here in Union County. But I'm just kidding. The whole point of beta testing is to get user feedback as we're developing the tool to make it better when we publicly release it. And we will publicly release it in April. And what you're going to do in this tool is you can go in there and you'll drop a pin on the map. So many of you will drop in Union, but maybe you'll drop in Stanley. You're going to drop the pin on wherever you are on the map. And it's going to use all this data that's been generated to tell you, okay, based on that pin, what is your optimum planting window? It'll tell you the relationship between yield and planting date from March to July. Then once you pick your planting date, it'll tell you what the best maturity group and seeding rate combination is to use within that planting date. Or folks have asked me like, okay, if I know I'm planting double crop beans, you go in the tool and you say, okay, I'm planting from June 5 to June 15. You adjust it manually and it'll tell you what the best maturity group and seeding rate combination is depending on your production practices. So the tool's not ready to roll yet for a variety of reasons. I had hoped it would be, but we're working on it. But I ran the tool before I got out here, so I'm just gonna ask you the first question. If you drop the pin near Monroe, which I did, what do you think the optimum soybean planting date or period, I really should say period, is for Union County? The optimum soybean planting date was May 10th. What do you think the optimum planting period is where you're within 3 to 5 bushels per acre of the top yield? All right, so when I dropped the pin for Monroe, the optimum planting period was May 4th to May 24th. Okay, you're not losing that much yield if you push into the end of April. You're losing a lot if you push too much further forward than that. And so that's one thing you could do with the tool. Another thing you can do with the tool is I went into the tool and I said, okay, I'm going to be planting my double crop beans in Union County June 5 to June 15th. What is the highest yielding relative maturity I could use in that situation? And this is another one where we'll give off a Yeti. So if you want to guess what's the highest yielding relative maturity, so that's like a 2.6 or 7.1, not like a maturity group 4. It's got to be, the relative maturity. What do you think the highest yielding relative maturity was in that double crop range. Close enough. So when we ran this with Monroe dropped, the relative maturity that maximized yield was actually 4.4. Now I'll say there was little yield difference between that and some of the later maturing varieties, but numerically, that was a relative maturity that maximized yield in these later planting situations. You can see that's not what we saw at Cameron's farm in 2023, but that's the reason we're doing this research across multiple years and multiple environments to try to make a better prediction for y'all. So this tool is coming in April, and we hope you'll use it to help make some of your core agronomic decisions. Obviously, for 2024, you're not going to be making maturity group selections using this tool, but it can still help you refine your planting dates or what seeding rates you might use within a planting date maturity group combination. So the objective for this presentation was talk about some of the research we've done and how it can help make core agronomic decisions in double crop or late planted beans, and highlight the tool that's coming out to help you make decisions using this data soon. A couple more things I just want to note is that we have also released another tool which is called Beans Gone Wild. Has anybody used Beans Gone Wild? All right, a few folks, so let me just tell you about this tool. You might want to use it. So what this tool does is it catalogs soybean production issues that are arising across the state. And it also gives photos and recommendations on how you might resolve those issues. It's real time, pictures are getting uploaded. 2023 was our beta testing year for the development of this tool, but we'll have more individuals contributing to the tool in 2024, which means there'll be more things going on the map. And I'll just give you an example of something that might be uploaded on this tool. So I actually pulled this out of the Union County site we had in 2023. It's up there on the map. And it shows some pictures of soybean green stem. And it describes what the issue is. So what do y'all think controls soybean green stem? Okay, environmental stress. Often genetics are blamed. And so in at this particular site in these beans, we actually saw the same variety. It was planted in late March and it was planted in mid-April. That same variety planted in mid-March had no green stem, planted in mid-April was slam up with green stem. And so we had a big description of this and the environment and genetic interaction that drives this in the tool. And maybe you're seeing green stem on your farm and you want a better understanding of the issue. You can go on here. Maybe you're seeing some new pathogen emerge that you've never seen before. You can go on Beans Gone Wild and see if someone else is seeing that in North Carolina. So that's the power of the tool. And then everything in this tool is cataloged into a library. So if you've got a new individual working on your farm and they need to get up to speed on what some of the soybean production issues are, they can go to the Beans Gone Wild library and see high quality photos and descriptions of some of the issues emerging across the state. And the last thing I'll mention is, I was nervous to come here and do this presentation about double crop beans in Union County and the surrounding areas because we have not done a lot of research in that area in recent years. Recognize that's not great, and we are pushing some more resources into doing double crop soybean research. I just want to give you all a little bit of a pulse on where the research program's headed now that we've sunsetted some of those big efforts on updating our core agronomics. And one of the areas we're going to be focusing on heavily is how you need to manage your beans in a double crop situation from an intensity perspective. And Jenny Carlio, who many of you know, is working on graduate school in the program and will be leading those efforts. So if you know Jenny, you know there'll be a success. So we are up in the game on the double crop research. We're also going to be doing more research on the different growth habits, indeterminate, determinate, across the diversity of planting dates. We'll be doing some more work on desiccation. That'll be in full season beans. We continue to do a lot of work on the seed quality side, both from a protein and oil perspective, but also a seed damage perspective. We have some national research looking at nitrogen credits from soybeans to following crops. We are large part of the Farmers for Soil Health efforts across the nation, working with Jeff and the Soybean Producers Association and a new extension associate we have. We'll continue to do product evaluations where it fits, And we'll continue to try to develop decision support tools to help you use the data that's generated at NC State to try to make more robust decisions. So that's where we're headed in the research portfolio. If you have ideas on things you want to see in a double crop planting situation from a research perspective, now is a good time to share them, because we're really re-envisioning what our research portfolio is going to be over the next couple years. So that's what I hope to cover, and glad to try to take any questions or comments or ideas that you have. Okay.